Chapter 10. Lecture. Genetic Engineering. Playing roulette with Mother Nature's designs?
All right. In our last session together, I talked about two major issues in biology. One of the major issues I talked about was the importance of Mendel's experiments on the garden pea plant and his findings about how certain traits are passed from one generation to the next. The other major issue I talked about was the role heredity and genetics play in who we are, what we look like, and, to some extent, how we behave. Today, I'll be talking about genetic engineering. I'll go over what genetic engineering is, and then I'll be touching on some of the important advances that have been made in recent years using genetic engineering. And I'll also discuss some controversies that have arisen, specific concerns that some people have about genetic engineering. Some of these concerns are practical, and others are ethical. I'll be giving some examples of genetic engineering projects in the field of agriculture and also in the field of medicine. All right, what do we mean by genetically modified, GM, or genetically engineered? A genetically engineered or genetically modified organism, or a GMO as they are sometimes called, is an organism whose genetic material has been altered by the introduction of DNA from a different source. This new DNA causes the organism to function in a different way, and this function or trait can then be inherited by succeeding generations, whether it's a plant or an animal. The new trait can then be passed on. We call the modified organism transgenic, because it contains genes that were transferred from a different organism. Now, what kinds of desired modifications could we be talking about here? Well, as I said earlier, one area where this technology is very widely used is in the field of agriculture, to improve either livestock or crops, such as corn and wheat. So let's start off with the field of agriculture. We can see the evidence of genetic engineering of crops sitting right on the supermarket shelves, probably in that box of cornflakes you bought at the supermarket recently. I'm going to give you some statistics that may surprise you. An estimated 85% of the corn grown in the United States is genetically modified. 91% of soybeans are genetically modified. 88% of cotton. And nearly 70% of processed foods, that include soft drinks, soup, crackers, are genetically modified. Now, let me add that outside the United States, those percentages are lower, and there has been greater resistance to GMOs. But at least in the United States, use of GMOs is widespread. Is this something to be concerned about? All right. Let's consider why we would want to modify foods, and in what way. We'll talk about the specific goals of genetic engineering in agriculture, how the creation of GMOs has achieved or is trying to achieve these goals, and what concerns have arisen as a result. The primary goal is to increase food production worldwide. The area of our planet that is currently used for agricultural production is decreasing every year, and meanwhile, the world population is increasing. So, there is an ongoing need for greater productivity in agriculture if we are going to feed the world now and in the future. How specifically do you increase productivity? Well, one way is to make plants disease and insect resistant so that more of the crop survives and is harvested. Corn, peanuts, and potatoes have all been transgenically modified to be resistant to harmful insects by introduction of a gene that produces a toxin called Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT. When an insect eats BT corn or BT peanuts, the toxin kills the insect. Transgenic BT crops produce enough toxin to actually kill the harmful insect, so farmers don't need to spray their crops with insecticides, which are bad because they also kill the good insects. And the result is healthier and bigger crops. So, is there a downside to Bt crops? Well, yes. The fact is that in nature, when an organism is exposed to a toxin, over time it develops a resistance to the toxin. In other words, it takes more toxin to kill it. And already we see that with Bt cotton crops in some parts of India, where there is a worm that is now resistant to Bt. So that is a challenge for genetic engineers. Okay, what are some other ways to modify crops to increase production? One is to engineer them for drought resistance so that they can thrive in areas where there is limited water. Also, crops have been genetically engineered to ripen more slowly so that they can be shipped great distances without spoiling. Another way to increase global food production is to engineer crops or animals to mature more quickly. We see an example of this in aquaculture, which is the most rapidly growing area of agriculture today. Salmon farming accounts for a large part of aquaculture. By 2007, nearly 70% of the world's salmon was raised on fish farms. Recently, a biotech company has created a transgenic salmon by introducing a growth hormone from a different kind of salmon, and the resulting fish reaches adult size twice as fast. If it is approved by the FDA, that's the U.S. government agency that regulates food, the GM salmon would be the first genetically altered animal to be approved for human consumption in the United States. Now, as I have said, in the United States, the public has become more or less accepting of GM crops, corn, wheat, tomatoes, soybeans. But what about animals? What about fish? The fact is that the GM salmon, and some people call it a Frankenfish, a reference to that famous story about the monster, the fish has met with enormous resistance from the American public. Why? Critics have two main concerns. First, its safety for human consumption. The genetically altered fish has never been eaten before, and it could cause dangerous allergies, especially because seafood tends to be quite allergenic. And second, the potential environmental impact. Environmentalists are concerned that the fish will escape and breed with the wild salmon population, which is already endangered, or the genetically modified super salmon could simply wipe out the wild salmon's food supply. So, yes, GMOs have contributed to increases in global food production, but controversies and practical concerns remain. Okay, now let's turn to genetic engineering in medicine. The first area I'll mention is the production of pharmaceuticals, drugs, by genetic engineering. This is sometimes referred to as farming, spelled with a PH instead of an F. As you can guess, it refers to agricultural production, or farming, of pharmaceuticals, in which a gene that produces a useful drug is inserted into the cells of a host animal or plant. The host then begins to produce the drug, for example, insulin. This is more economical than having to produce it in a laboratory. And then, to create more of the drug, you use cloning technology to reproduce the plant or animal. Some examples are safflower, a plant that produces an oil used in cooking. A GM version of safflower that produces insulin has been developed. Another example is a transgenic goat that produces milk containing antithrombin, a protein that is very important in preventing the formation of blood clots. In 2009, the FDA granted marketing approval for transgenic goat antithrombin, the first drug to be produced in genetically modified livestock. Okay, another area where genetic engineering is used is in the creation of animal models of human diseases. Genetically modified mice are the most commonly used. One common practice is to remove a gene from a mouse, creating what is called a knockout mouse. Knocking out the activity of a gene provides information about what that gene normally does. It turns out that humans and mice share many genes, so observing the characteristics of knockout mice gives researchers information that can be used to better understand how a similar gene may cause or contribute to disease in humans. Knockout mice have been used to research many diseases and conditions, including cancers, obesity, heart disease, diabetes, arthritis, anxiety, aging, and Parkinson's disease. Finally, gene therapy, which is the genetic engineering of humans by replacing defective human genes with functional copies. This can be done in somatic cells, that is, where the effect is on the body of only a particular individual, or in germline cells, where the effect can be passed down to that person's offspring. Gene therapy has been used to treat patients suffering from immune deficiencies, and research on some other genetic disorders is ongoing. However, success has been limited, and there have been a few deaths associated with gene therapy. Also, ethicists have questions about gene therapy. Should this technology be used only for treatment of disease? If a person wants to use it to improve their physical appearance or live longer, should they be able to? And to be honest, questions like this are overly simplistic because most human traits are caused by multiple genes in complex combinations that we do not yet understand. So we might say that gene therapy raises practical as well as ethical concerns. However, we will probably have to face questions like this in the future. Should we be able to change ourselves through genetic engineering? Another even more controversial question: should a couple expecting a baby be able to make sure, through genetic screening, that the child they're expecting will not be born with some hereditary disorder, such as very poor eyesight or mental depression, or even a tendency to be overweight? With the knowledge we have of human genetics and with the techniques we have for both newborn and prenatal screening, how long will it be before we're screening and maybe selecting human embryos for characteristics such as physical strength or other qualities such as eye color, hair color, you name it? Okay, so we've looked at how far we have come in understanding and manipulating genetics. But there are still a great many unknowns concerning the environmental and human consequences of our actions. Do we really know what we're doing, or are we playing roulette with Mother Nature? Whatever you may think about the ethics of the genetic engineering of humans or animals, today biologists are using genetic engineering for two main purposes. 1. In agriculture, to address the global need for food, and 2, in medicine, to make newer, and they hope, better drugs and to cure disease. Okay, well, that is a lot to think about.